Well, good evening, and thank you for joining us for this presentation provided in partnership with Wheaton Drama. My name is Barry Erickson, and I am Community Engagement Coordinator at Wheaton Public Library. We are going to get a behind-the-scenes look at the Lindbergh kidnapping, controversial crime and trial that captured the nation's attention in the early 1930s. Wheaton Drama is one of the oldest continuously running community theaters in Illinois. In a typical year, members offer the community 5 to 6 productions, including musicals, variety shows, and plays like this one. Located in the heart of downtown at 111 North Hale Street, the theater is a multiple Best of Wheaton Award winner. Wheaton Drama was recently the recipient of 14 Lou Award nominations for excellence in theatrical achievement. We want to thank Wheaton Drama for continuing to share their time and talent with the community, pivoting to this format. The pandemic halted the production of Hauptmann less than a week before opening night. When the theater is able to reopen safely, their full production of Hauptmann will be on stage. A few members of the cast and crew are here tonight for this discussion and will be introducing themselves as they provide the information. And now I'm going to turn the screen over to Ken Caden, Director of Wheaton Drama. Thank you for being here, Ken.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you to Barry Erickson and to the Wheaton Library for having us. And on behalf of Wheaton Drama, thanks to all of you for listening. My name is Ken Caden, and I'm an attorney and the director of Hauptmann by John Logan at Wheaton Drama. Wheaton Drama will be opening Hauptmann as soon as safety and COVID-19 will allow us to do so, and for obvious reasons, no dates have been set. With me this evening are my assistant director, Linda Spedlowski, and the actor playing the title role of Bruno Richard Hauptmann, and himself, a fine attorney and public defender for DuPage County, Garrett Ard. We'll be offering a presentation about the famous Lindbergh kidnapping case, discuss briefly the difficulties involved in mounting a production that deals with historical events and people, and take some questions at the end. I'll begin by sharing some details about the kidnapping itself. Linda will then offer her thoughts on the investigation of the crime, and Garrett will then present his insights as a criminal defense attorney himself on the trial of Bruno Richard Hauptmann, the only person ever charged with the Lindbergh kidnapping. Now, in order to fully understand the matter that has been called the most influential and important kidnapping since that of Helen by the Trojans, we must first get a little bit of historical perspective about the context of the kidnapping. By virtue of having been the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic from New York to Paris in the spirit of St. Louis in 1927, Charles Augustus Lindbergh made himself into one of the greatest heroes and most idolized men of the era. Others had flown across the Atlantic previously, but Lindbergh was the first to do it alone. And that fact is the one that seems to have captured the public's imagination more than any other. In fact, upon landing and attempting to exit his plane in Paris, Lindbergh asserted that his feet never were allowed to touch the ground for at least half an hour as he was borne aloft by the cheering French crowd. Next slide, please. And similar levels of idolatry were to be his when he returned to the United States. Lindbergh was the lone eagle both by sobriquet and temperament. Next slide. He was fiercely independent and not generally a warm person. He would later argue for isolationism during World War II, become fascinated with Nazi Germany, the study of eugenics, or the creation of a master race. President Roosevelt privately referred to him as a Nazi. He was also quite the practical joker. The severity of his jests ranged in cruelty from intentionally dripping water on his wife's pale blue silk dress at a Hollywood party, which was also, by the way, attended by Amelia Earhart, to pranks that he pulled on fellow pilots as he was running the route from St. Louis to Chicago carrying the mail. And those pranks employed everything from itching powder to live snakes to putting his fellow pilots' beds up on the barracks roof. And in one instance, he filled a fellow pilot's water bottle with kerosene. After the friend drank from the bottle, he had to be rushed to the hospital with severe internal burns and nearly died. The prank, however, that's most relevant to the kidnapping occurred about 2 months prior to the kidnapping of his young son. The aviator took it upon himself to hide Charlie in a closet, declaring to everyone in the household that he had in fact been kidnapped. And while they frantically searched for them, he quietly chuckled to himself. He left his son in the closet for some 20 minutes until finally laughing uproariously, producing him and telling everybody that it was just a hoax. Now, kidnapping itself was very much in vogue as the Roaring 20s gave way to the dreary 30s. Gangsters had taken over the public's attention and gang wars dominated current events. In fact, in the 3 years up to 1932, some 2,500 kidnappings had taken place in the United States. Now, at the first, the public was rather indifferent to the rise in kidnappings because gang members were largely kidnapping other gang members. It's only when their attentions turned to bankers and other wealthy individuals did the public become more concerned. And it became bad enough and a popular enough way of making money that insurance companies started offering kidnap insurance. And Bing Crosby and Marlene Dietrich were among the first in line to purchase such a policy. However, kidnapping was neither a federal offense, nor was it a felony in New Jersey at the time that young Charles Lindbergh was snatched. They later became so as a direct result of the kidnapping of 20-month-old Charles Lindbergh Jr. called Charlie. And that slide, let's have a look at Charlie. This is actually a picture that was taken on his first birthday. Even though he was 20 months old at the time of the kidnapping, this is the picture that made it onto the wanted posters, causing some to ask why the Lindberghs didn't have a more recent picture available. The evening of the kidnapping, March 1st, 1932, was a windy Tuesday. The rain from earlier in the day had stopped, and the day of the week is important because the Lindbergh house, which was near Hopewell, New Jersey, was unfinished. The Lindberghs didn't reside there while they were working in the house, except on weekends. During the week, they stayed at the home of Ann's parents in Englewood, New Jersey, which was called Next Day Hill. Charlie had, in fact, never before been in residence at the new house at Hopewell on a Tuesday night. And the Lindberghs only did so on this occasion because Charlie had a cold. Ann was hoping to give him the opportunity to recover. And indeed, the decision to remain that night was only made by Ann the same morning. So an outside observer following their patterns would have had no way of knowing that the Lindberghs would even be in residence that night. Moreover, the house was in a somewhat isolated part of the Sauerland Mountains. It was wooded, the roads were narrow, difficult to navigate, even in broad daylight. The property was large enough so that Lindbergh could put an airfield on the grounds. He had some 400 acres, in fact, for that purpose. And it was not particularly fertile ground, but it was perfect for his purposes. Because Charlie's cold was no better and Ann had come down with a cold herself, they decided to stay that night as well. And on the morning of March 1st, Ann placed a call to the Morrow's residence, summoning Betty Gow, Charlie's Scottish nursemaid, to help her take care of Charlie. Now, Violet Sharp, a parlor maid in the Morrow household, took the call. She was one of only a handful of people who knew of the sudden decision to stay over at Hopewell on the Tuesday night, and Betty was eventually brought over by the limo driver. Now, during the afternoon, it had cleared a bit, giving way to a stiff wind, and Charlie played with his dog, Wagoosh, and Ann went for a walk. At the end of the walk, she stopped to throw a pebble at Charlie's window, having to maneuver to keep from stepping in the mud. Charlie was given a supper of cereal, seated at a small maple table in the center of his nursery. He was then readied for his bedtime, which was about 8 p.m. He was given an application of Vicks Vapo Rub on his chest, And to help keep out the drafts, Charlie was bundled up in a little flannel shirt with blue Silco thread that had been put together by Betty Gow, and a Dr. Denton's sleeping suit was placed over everything. Seems like he was a bit overdressed for the occasion, and it got even worse because he was then tucked into bed with safety pins through the blanket, sheet, and mattress in order to keep him from removing his bedclothes. Under Lindbergh's strict instructions, and by that I mean Charles, not Anne, his son was not to be visited between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock p.m. so as not to coddle him. And let's see the map of the nursery. Here we see the layout of Charlie's nursery. As you can see in that map that there are 3 windows altogether, with north being up at the top of this drawing. We have a fireplace on the east wall with smaller windows on either side of it. There's a larger window box and French window to the south. You can see in the lower left corner, there's a little pink and green screen that was used to keep out drafts. The maple table I just referred to is right in the center of the room, and the crib is on the west wall. Now, of the 3 windows, all 3 had shutters, but only the south French window and the northmost of the 2 east windows actually had shutters that locked. For some strange reason, the shutter in the southeast corner, which we can see is marked with an X, became warped. It had been so for some 3 weeks or so, and nobody had done anything to correct it. And that is the one that's marked with the X is the one which is presumably used by the kidnappers. When they went to put him to bed, both of the east windows were closed and the south window was opened a bit in order to allow in fresh air. But again, the 2 shutters other than the one on the southeast are the only ones that locked. Is it a coincidence that the kidnappers chose to come in via the only window with a shutter that didn't lock, even though both Anne and Betty Gow had tried to do so? The Lindbergh himself arrived at the house at approximately 8:25. The reason that he arrived that late has really never been adequately explained. He should have arrived later still because he had a speaking engagement in New York City, but uncharacteristically for him, who always decried people who weren't organized, he forgot to attend it. So why he came home as late as 8:25 is not really known. He ate dinner with Anne until about 9:10, and then they retired to the living room where Charles heard above the wind, which had picked up quite a bit, a sharp crack. It was heard by no one else. He later described it as sounding like the top slats of an orange box falling off a chair. He presumed that the sound had come from the kitchen. Betty Gow returned to the nursery at approximately 10 p.m. to take Charlie to the bathroom, only to find him missing from his crib. She then asked Anne if she had him, to which Anne replied in the negative. And both of their first thoughts then went to Colonel Lindbergh and his prank of 2 months earlier. Betty ran downstairs to the study to ask him, and when he replied in the negative, he quickly joined his wife in front of the empty crib and said, "Anne, they've stolen our baby." Lindbergh promptly told one of the household staff to telephone the Hopewell Police Department. He grabbed his rifle and he went out into the howling night, but he had no flashlight and couldn't see. So he told that member of the staff, Ollie Waitley, or Watley, I think it's actually pronounced, to drive into Hopewell to get flashlights. And Lindbergh returned to the house. He phoned his lawyer, Colonel Henry Breckenridge, and the New Jersey State Police as well. Ollie returned with the police whom he had met on the road, and the Hopewell police arrived with flashlights. Lindbergh then took them up to the nursery. An examination of the room revealed that beneath the southeast window was a chest. Let's switch slides here. And you can see at the very lower portion of that photograph, there is the chest and a suitcase on top of it. I have also read somewhere that there was a Tinker Toy rabbit on top of the suitcase as well. And in this picture, we can see what appears to be a stein in the corner of the window that was the one through which the kidnapper or kidnappers had come. The window itself was closed when they took the police up to the room. There were small particles of yellow clay on top of the suitcase and on the carpet. Neither the suitcase nor the chest nor any other objects in the area appeared to have been disturbed. Lindbergh told the officers that there was an envelope lying on top of the radiator grill that's in the windowsill that's being pictured here. He actually at that point decided to assume command and told them that they were not to touch it until the fingerprint expert arrived. No one else in the house had seen the envelope until Lindbergh revealed it. Now, recently, a new book has just been published on this subject called Suspect Number 1. I haven't read it. It was only just published on September 1st of this year. I believe, though, from what I can tell of reviews of it, that they regard Suspect Number 1 as Charles Lindbergh himself. There is another book that I'm aware of that does take that same position, which is called Crime of the Century, The Lindbergh Kidnapping Hoax, written by Gregory Algren and Stephen Monier, two attorneys, one a criminal defense attorney, the other a prosecutor and former police chief. They take the position that Lindbergh was in fact responsible for the kidnapping himself, that it would probably started as another one of his hoaxes where he was going to kidnap the child through the window himself, inadvertently dropped the baby, and rather than appear at the front door with his dead son in his hands, he decided to improvise and invented a kidnapping. As we will see, the body of Charlie was found just 5 miles roughly from the house itself. In any case, according to the book that I just described, Suspect Number 1, the crime scene photos do not show the ransom note on the windowsill. Now, that seems inconsistent that Lindbergh, being concerned with the fingerprints, would himself move the envelope before the police arrived. There's no smell of chloroform in the air. Next slide, please. And an examination of the crib revealed that the safety pins securing the bedclothes were still in place. Some therefore have speculated that the baby must have been removed by his feet because the safety pins were still there. Betty Gow insisted, no, that wasn't the case. The foot of the bed was still secured. He had to have been, even though the safety pins were in place, he had to be lifted up from the front, from the top of the head of the bed. It's noteworthy, however, that no sounds were heard by anybody in the house from the nursery. And it then causes us to ask the question as to whether he knew the person who removed him, or was he otherwise silenced? Next slide. Also silent was the skittish fox terrier named Wagoosh, whom we see here. Now, to paraphrase from the Sherlock Holmes story Silverblaze by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, is there any point to which you would wish to draw my attention, Holmes? To the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. But Holmes, the dog did nothing in the nighttime. That was the curious incident. One's view as to whether or not the silence of Wagoosh is suspicious depends somewhat on one's overview of the case. To some, it's indicative of an inside job, but in any event, Wagoosh, in fact, did nothing in the night. Others, who are less likely to see nefarious doings other than by another kidnapper, opined that Wagoosh may have been at the other end of the house in the staff's quarters. Next slide, please. When Lindbergh finally did lead the police outside, they found 2 holes in the wet soil beneath the nursery window that corresponded with the uprights of a ladder. Now, the holes, however, as you can kind of see in this picture, are somewhat to the right of the window. This may have been, as we can see, the window on the lower floor. The nursery window isn't really pictured here, but this may have been to avoid being seen from the library, which is what's in that window directly below the nursery. The ladder itself was found some 70 feet away, and it was an oddly constructed affair of weathered wood with the rungs some 19 inches apart rather than the customary 12 inches. It was built in 3 parts, and the parts nested within each other. The police were later to determine, however, from scuff marks on the side of the house, that only 2 of the sections of the letter, of the 3 parts of the letter, had been used. This created other issues with the theory of the case as to why only 2 parts were used, because the ladder then extended, as you can see in the picture, some 30 inches short of the windowsill. There were also 2 sets of fresh footprints headed to the road in a southeasterly direction. Taken all together, all of these facts led to the conclusion by some that at least 2 people had committed the crime. The one who had entered through the window via the nursery window and then handed Charlie through the window, possibly in a sack, to a second person who had then remained on the ladder. It's impossible to believe the position that was ultimately taken by the state of New Jersey at the 1935 trial, which I'm sure Garrett will discuss, that any one person, first of all, would have known which was the nursery window. Second, if they knew where their nursery was, how did they happen to pick the one window where the shutters were warped? How did they manage to remove Charlie from the crib silently? How did they maneuver past the suitcase and the chest that we saw so as to leave them undisturbed? Then left a ransom note on a windowsill despite a howling wind, and the ransom note did not blow off the window. The window, you'll recall, was also found closed when the police were introduced to the room. So the kidnapper, if it were in fact a lone person, would have had to have gone through the window while carrying the 30-pound Charlie and closed the window and then descended with the child. In fact, all of the police and law enforcement people assigned to the case initially concluded that there had to be multiple people involved in the kidnapping, and one of the first people to draw that conclusion was Lindbergh himself. New Jersey State Trooper Wolf said, "The kidnappers consisted apparently of a party of at least 2 or more persons. Apparently 2 members of the party proceeded on foot to the east side of the Lindbergh residence and assembled a 3-piece homemade extension ladder." Eventually, New Jersey State Trooper Frank Kelly was the designated fingerprint expert, and after arriving around midnight, carefully employed a black powder method of testing for fingerprints on both the outside of the envelope and the letter within. He found none. I'm going to have to speed up because I'm taking up too much time and I'm stepping on both Garrett's and Linda's time. So I'm sorry if I'm going quickly over the remainder of this. Trooper Kelly also failed to find any latent prints on the ladder, an old 3-inch, quarter-inch chisel that was found on the ground outside, the windowsill, the crib, or on Charlie's toys. Not of the parents, not the staff, nor of any of outsiders, fingerprints you would expect to find, as if the room had been wiped clean of prints. When it was suggested that Trooper Kelly's methods might be wanting, those in charge of the investigation declined to use potentially more sensitive silver nitrate or iodine methods. Now, once Trooper Kelly arrived, determined that there were no fingerprints, they opened the ransom note. May we have that, please? The ransom note itself was written in pencil in an apparently disguised hand, and it read, "Dear sir, have $50,000 ready, $25,000 in $20 bills, $15,000 in $10 bills, and $10,000 in $5 bills. After 2 days, we will inform you where to deliver the money. We warn you for making anything public or for notify the police. The child is in good care. Indication for all letters are signature and 3 holds. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner that the signature appears of 2 interlocking circles, which are blue, and a red oval, and 3 square holes in a horizontal line across the middle. Meantime, the flash put out by the state police had been picked up by the media, and they descended in hordes. Lindbergh was news, kidnappings were news, and the combination of the two was dynamite. In fact, when Inspector Harry Walsh of the New Jersey City Police arrived at noon the next day, he found no less than 400 press people and photographers, including the entire staff of the International News Photo Service. Now, the investigation, at least nominally, was supposed to be headed by the superintendent of the New Jersey State Troopers. This gentleman, Colonel H. Norman Schwarzkopf. Yep, that slide, please. Yep, that Norman Schwarzkopf, the father of the Gulf War general. He was a graduate of West Point, and he was a World War I veteran, but honestly, the state troopers were more a quasi-military organization, more than involved in crime detection. And while he did study crime investigation before obtaining his post with the troopers, he had also worked as a floor walker in a department store. He had never walked a beat and had never arrested a criminal at the time of the Lindbergh kidnapping. It was in part due to his lack of investigative experience, and part because of the compelling and mesmerizing personality of Charles Lindbergh, that Lindbergh made perfectly clear that he was taking over the investigation, that the first priority of any law enforcement efforts was to be the safe recovery of his son and not the arrest of any of the perpetrators. And while several factors pointed to an inside job, Lindbergh made it very clear that his staff was not to be touched. And while Betty Gow was first suspected, she was quickly cleared, though the kidnapping was to haunt her for the rest of the days. In the meantime, Lindbergh and others assumed that the kidnapping had been the work of a crime gang. They tried to get not only a swindler by the name of Morris Mickey Rosner involved, but also even Al Capone, who had been languishing at the time in a Cook County jail cell awaiting transfer to a federal penitentiary, said he could get the Lindbergh baby back in 48 hours, and no leads were developed by either one of them. Next slide, please. Meantime, in the Bronx, a 72-year-old elementary school principal and part-time college professor by the name of Dr. John F. Condon sent a letter to the editor published in the March 8th edition of the Bronx Home News, circulation 100,000, offering 1,000 of his own money and to act as a go-between between the Lindberghs and the kidnappers. And much to his surprise, he actually did get a response. He went to a lecture, and when he returned from the lecture, there was a note in his house that basically said, "Dear Dr. Condon, Mr. Dr. Condon, we accept you as the mediator in between the Lindberghs and us. Eventually, they said, if you have the money ready, you should print something in the paper saying that the money is ready, and we will trust you to do it." In fact, then he called the Lindberghs and read to the Lindberghs a letter that was within the letter as to whether he should be allowed to act as the intermediary or not. And it read like this. "Dear Sir," Condon read, "Mr. Condon may act as go-between. You may give him the $70,000. Make one packet. Note that the amount has changed from 50,000 to 70,000 because the Lindberghs were not supposed to tell the police. The size will be about," and then there's a diagram showing a box of about 7 by 6 by 14 inches. "And we have notified you already what kind of bills. We warn you not to set any trap in any way. If you or someone else will notify the police, there will be a further delay. After we have the money in hand, we will tell you where to find your boy. You may have an airplane ready It is about 150 miles away, but before telling you the address, there will be a delay of 8 hours in between. Condon then called the Lindbergh residents, who claimed to have spoken to Lindbergh personally. Lindbergh denied it, by the way. Dr. Lindbergh, or Dr. Condon, excuse me, had a gift for self-promotion. In fact, he finally says he was told by Lindbergh that Lindbergh would come to him, but he said, no, you've got enough on your mind already. I'll come to you. He then drove to the Lindbergh's house, arriving at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, at which time he asked to speak to Mrs. Lindbergh. From his book, Jaffe Tells All, she stretched out her arms toward me instinctively, the age-old appeal of motherhood. Will you help me get back my baby? And after brushing away her tear in his gallant act of self-promotion, Condon agrees to be the intermediary that they sought. They're then told, after when the money is ready, then a cab driver by the name of Joseph Perrone comes to the house and hands Condon another note, giving him directions to meet at the cemetery. Condon then calls his friend, former professional boxer by the name of Al Reich, and the two of them, following the directions that were handed over in the note, drive to Woodlawn Cemetery to make the connection, even though he didn't have the money and it wasn't ready. Next slide, please. These are the gates to Woodlawn Cemetery, where he went to meet a person who became known as Cemetery John. Condon claims to have spent close to an hour in Cemetery John's company, describes him as having almond-shaped eyes and a fleshy growth on his left thumb, neither of which, by the way, describe Hauptmann. He told him he didn't have the money, that he needed some sort of proof of life, as it were. And yes, Robert Blinick, there was some sort of accent involved. Condon asked him whether he was German. He asked, "Bist du Deutsch?" Cemetery John claimed not to understand him and told him no, he was in fact Scandinavian. But he said that they would send some sort of proof that they had the baby. That proof eventually came in the form of a pair of Dr. Dentons. Now, whether it was those were Dr. Dentons were commercially available, whether they were particular or peculiar to Charlie is unknown, but it was enough to satisfy Lindbergh that they were genuine. They therefore got the money together, the $50,000 as described. The extra 20 they were also procured, but Condon ended up not handing that to the kidnappers. And eventually, on April 2nd of 1932, Condon went this time with Lindbergh to the cemetery, but the note had said, "Come alone." Condon got out of the car, and next slide, please, at St. Raymond Cemetery, eventually handed the money over to Cemetery John at St. Raymond Cemetery in exchange for a note. The note read as, although we were told not to open it for some 8 hours, he and Lindbergh were in the car, drove about a mile away and opened the note, which read as follows. Next slide, please. The boy is on Bodenelli. It is a small boat, some 28 feet long. There are persons on the boat, and they are innocent. You will find the boat on Horseneck Beach and Gayhead Island near Elizabeth Island, which is off Cape Cod in Massachusetts. They felt extremely happy that they had successfully completed the exchange. And in fact, Lindbergh flew the next day handwriting comparison will be discussed later. Please hold your questions, Robert. He flew the next day to out of Connecticut to the area, and of course, sadly, no boat named Nellie or any other boat, nor his live son was seen anywhere in that vicinity. The whole thing finally came to a conclusion on May the 12th of 1932, resolving the issue once and for all, when a truck driver by the name of William Allen stopped by the roadside in order to perform his necessary duty, found a small clearing in the woods, and in that small clearing he found upside down a badly decomposed body of what he assumed was a child, and later identified by Charles and Betty Gow by the shirt with the blue silk thread. And at that point, and only at that point, did the attempt to exchange the money for the live child end, and the investigation truly began. And here to talk about that is Assistant Director to Hauptmann at Wheaton Drama, Linda Spedlowski.
All right, everyone can hear me, I hope. Hi everyone, my name is Linda Spedlowski. I am the Assistant Director of Hauptmann, and I will be taking over this portion of the presentation to discuss the discovery of the body and the arrest of Hauptmann. So let's see, now I just want to, just a moment.
Do you see the icon to screen share, Linda?
You know, it is behind the video, so let me change my gallery. There it is. There it is. All right, wonderful. So here to start off with, you see photographs of William Allen showing the place where the body was discovered and the investigation beginning. So, an examination of the remains revealed that the child had died as a result of a severe blow to the head, resulting in a skull fracture spanning the top of his head to behind the left ear. A second blow resulted in a 1-inch hole situated at the back of the right ear. Exposure to the elements and surrounding animals, which had carried off parts of the remains, would have made identification challenging, but the infant's characteristic golden curls and the location of its remains within 5 miles of the Lindbergh house strongly suggested that the little eaglet that the world had searched for had at last been found. If the remains were indeed proof of the death of baby Lindbergh, the cruelest aspect of this discovery was the confirmation by the examining physician that the child had been dead for over 2 months and was likely killed on the very night of his disappearance. It was initially supposed that the kidnappers had murdered the child out of fear of discovery, but taking into consideration the broken ladder abandoned on the Lindbergh's property, investigators came to the conclusion that the death had been accidental and that the child had fallen while the kidnappers were descending the ladder. There still remained room for doubt. At the time of the discovery, as Ken was mentioning, Colonel Charles Lindbergh was away from home conducting his own personal investigation. This was conducted on board a yacht on the Atlantic. He claimed to be engaged in negotiations with the boy's kidnappers for the safe return of his son. Was it possible that hope remained for baby Lindbergh? Could the location of the body found not far from the road to Hopewell, New Jersey be merely a coincidence? Lindbergh's investigation yielded no results, and the discovery of the child's body in the woods so close to where baby Lindbergh had been abducted forced Lindbergh to abandon these fruitless negotiations and return home. The body had been positively identified as Charles A. Lindbergh Jr. by his nurse, Betty Gow. She was first given articles of clothing which she recognized as having been worn by the child on the night of his disappearance, including the undershirt embroidered with blue thread. With interest, it was noted that the sleeping suit was missing. Gow later viewed the body and confirmed that the child had the same golden curly hair, number of teeth, and the peculiar characteristic of overlapping toes as baby Lindbergh. Despite this positive identification, Colonel Charles Lindbergh insisted on making his own identification. He acknowledged the hereditary physical characteristics and finally accepted that the body that was discovered in the woods was indeed the body of his only son. He immediately arranged for the cremation of the remains. The news of the Lindbergh baby devastated his family and enraged the public that had followed every detail of the enthralling story. All were united in the desire for this discovery of the kidnappers who had mercilessly slain and abandoned an innocent child, and that those kidnappers should face justice for their crimes. All substantial leads in the investigation had been exhausted, leaving authorities to sift through thousands of false leads and conspiracy theories. The mystery remained, but the world demanded an answer. Who had kidnapped and murdered the Lindbergh baby? One might also ask how an obscure German immigrant named Bruno Richard Hauptmann came to be involved in the case that captivated the world. His involvement did not occur until nearly 2 years after the discovery of the remains. During that time, the Lindberghs had sold the Hopewell property and moved away. Anne Morrow Lindbergh had given birth to a second son named John, and the Lindberghs were anxious to escape the intensity of the public eye that had once regarded them with pure adoration. Congress had passed the Federal Kidnapping Act, also known as Lindbergh's Law, which granted federal agents the ability to investigate kidnappings assumed to have occurred across state lines. But it was another government ordinance that would finally bring about a break in the cold case and transform the previously unknown Bruno Richard Hauptmann into the most notorious man in the world. A mandate had been issued by the Roosevelt administration recalling all gold certificate bills and requiring that all certificates be replaced by May of 1933. This was done to discourage the hoarding of gold, but the mandate was providential for the Lindbergh investigators, since gold certificate bills had made up a considerable sum of the ransom money paid to the mysterious man only known as John, who had failed to live up to his part of the cemetery bargain. Serious attempts had been made to locate the marked gold certificates with lists of the individual serial numbers distributed to all major banks, but although bills turned up across the country, none of the certificates could successfully be traced back to any individual. Then, a gas station attendant at the Warner Quinlan gas station in the Bronx noticed that a customer paid for $1 worth of gas with a $10 gold certificate bill. Aware of the mandate which made such bills rare and suspecting that the bill might be counterfeit, he wrote down the license plate of the driver's car on the certificate bill. In doing so, he had no idea that he would provide the critical turning point in the case of the Lindbergh baby. The serial number of the certificate was matched to the list of the serial numbers from the ransom. License plate 4U1341 was traced to Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a 35-year-old German immigrant who had worked as a carpenter and lived with his wife Anna and his infant son Manfred in the Bronx. He seemed an unlikely suspect for the crime that many supposed to have been committed by a complex network of the criminal underworld. The fact that he had worked as a carpenter was significant because it would mean that he possessed the necessary skills and possibly the tools to have built the rudimentary ladder that was used in the kidnapping. But had he climbed the ladder? During the First World War, Hauptmann had served in the German army as a machine gunner and endured a head injury, which gave him severe vertigo. But strengthened by the suggestion made by Dr. John Condon that his mysterious contact John may have had a German accent, Hauptmann was immediately put under surveillance for several days before he was arrested on the morning of September 19th, 1934. At the time of his arrest, police searched Hauptmann and discovered another of the ransom gold certificate bills on his person before taking him in for questioning. Further search of his home and garage turned up seemingly damning pieces of evidence against Hauptmann, including Dr. John Condon's telephone number scrawled across a closet door, and a considerable portion of the ransom money hidden in the garage. Hauptmann denied any culpability in the Lindbergh case and claimed to have received the money from a friend named Isidore Fish. And here you can see one of the only photos we do have of Isidore Fish. Fish was a fellow German immigrant and fur trader with a reputation for involvement in disreputable money-making schemes. He met Hauptmann in 1932, the year of the Lindbergh kidnapping, and together they agreed to join their limited resources, which included Fish's fur trade and Hauptmann's stock options, together in an effort to improve their standard of living. Fish was a desperate character who lived on the brink of starvation and was seriously ill, and he was aware of that fact as well. It is worthy of note that Fish applied for travel to Germany on the very day that the body in the woods was discovered. According to Hauptmann, Fish had entrusted a box into his care while he was away in Germany. A roof leak damaged the box, and it was then that Hauptmann discovered the contents of the box, over $14,000, including gold certificate bills. Hauptmann's next moves were peculiar. He hid the box in his garage and refrained from sharing his discovery with his wife. Claiming that Fish had owed him money, Hauptmann decided that he had a right to the money within the box and began spending it, which was the fatal flaw that led to his arrest. Would he have spent the money if he had known where it had come from? And what had happened to the remainder of the ransom? Unfortunately, Isidor Fish could provide no explanation nor offer confirmation of Hauptmann's story. He died of tuberculosis in Germany several months before Hauptmann's arrest. Writing a letter of condolence to Fish's family, Hauptmann failed to mention the money. While Hauptmann certainly could not provide a satisfactory reason for having the ransom money in his possession, the remainder of the evidence was potentially problematic. Public scrutiny of the Lindbergh case was intense, and the investigation was subject to a media frenzy that potentially influenced the evidence against Hauptmann. A reporter from the New York Daily News claimed to have written Condon's contact information on Hauptmann's closet door himself. Certain pieces of evidence that might have exonerated Hauptmann were withheld by the authorities, and most significantly, Dr. John Condon initially failed to identify Hauptmann as John, his contact with the kidnappers. While Hauptmann was awaiting trial, Condon paid several visits to him in his cell, and based on the conversations he had with Hauptmann, even went so far as to claim that Hauptmann was not John. As the case against Hauptmann gained momentum, Condon changed his original declaration and, possibly under coercion, conceded that Hauptmann's voice and the voice of John were one and the same. As far as the authorities and the public were concerned, the baby killer had been captured and would have no chance of escaping retribution for his crimes. The fact that certificate bills from the ransom continued to circulate after Hauptmann's arrest was given little attention. It is certainly unlikely that Hauptmann, now branded as the most hated man in all the world, would have received fair treatment from the authorities who held him prisoner, and Hauptmann claimed to have been severely beaten during police interrogations in a letter written to his mother, which was suppressed and never sent. Quote, "When I was arrested, they almost crippled me by beating in order to apprehend something which is not in me. There are indeed societies for prevention of cruelty to animals, but unfortunately not for men." In this letter, Hauptmann also claimed to have been forced to copy out the words of the ransom notes exactly as they had been written, with misspellings and grammatical errors intact. Hauptmann's handwriting would later feature prominently in the trial against him. And that trial would later be known as the trial of the century. And it is at this point that I would like to turn over to the wonderful star of our production, Garrett.
Hello, everybody. My name is Garrett, as she just said. I have been asked to talk about the trial. And I've been picked to do that for probably two reasons. One, I am going to be portraying Bruno Richard Hauptmann in the play once we get to do it, fingers crossed. And second, and probably more importantly, I am a criminal defense attorney in my adult life. So I do this every day, and this is my job. And so I guess I have some insights into the criminal justice system. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about right now. When people learn that I'm in the show and they learn what the show's about and they learn what I do. And almost invariably, the first questions that they ask are, do you think he did it, or do you think he's guilty, or sometimes, how does that change how you perform in the show, how you act the part, or what have you? And those are certainly questions I've thought about. I will answer those questions, but I will answer those questions at the end. So give you something to stick around for, I guess. So about the trial, I think it's useful to look at it. One, I'll kind of go over the basics of the trial system in the United States, the criminal justice system, because I don't know what everyone's background is. Hopefully you haven't had opportunity to really get to know it up close. And discuss those central kind of tenets of the criminal justice system in relation to the case, and then look at the case like a criminal defense attorney does. Look at kind of the key pieces of evidence, or at least some of the key pieces of evidence, and interrogate them a little bit. And really, I'm just going to scratch the surface, because the trial obviously lasted 5 weeks and covered a whole lot of ground. So we'll just a little taste. First, the criminal justice system is in the United States has stayed relatively the same over this period of time. One of the core tenets is that it is an adversarial system. And that means essentially that the sides are adversaries. They are pitted against one another. They each are kind of single-minded in their goals. And in that kind of fighting between the prosecution and the defense, we're supposed to kind of reach a fair result. But implicit in the adversarial system, what's important to that is that both sides are on equal footing, are equally matched. And in this case, come trial time, that may not be completely true. The defense attorney, the lead defense attorney for Bruno Richard Hauptmann, was a man named Edward Riley. And he was an older attorney. He was very experienced. And so he should have known what he was doing. But by many accounts, he spent very little time actually talking to Hauptmann before the trial began. By some accounts, it was as little as 40 minutes total before the trial actually happened. And that's not enough, either then nor now, to prepare for a five-week trial. Also, other accounts talk in great length about his drunkenness, the fact that he drank every day during days of trial, and otherwise. And of course, I should go without saying that is also not acceptable. So we already start with some issues in the adversarial nature of the process. And in that adversarial process, you are supposed to have a neutral judge, a judge that is just there to call the balls and strikes, is just there to make the decisions in a neutral way, to keep both sides honest and keep the proceedings fair. And the judge in this case seemed to be a pretty fair jurist, but it maybe is an artifact more of the time. Throughout the transcript, if you read a lot of it, whenever the judge is asked to make decisions on rulings on the evidence, admitting evidence or objections and things like that, he pretty frequently will make commentary on the evidence itself. He will make comments like, well, I think there's an overwhelming amount of evidence, or I think that evidence is good, or he'll make commentary, which nowadays, if a judge did that, is a big no-no. They would get in a lot of trouble for doing that, and is not something that would seemingly be fair. If a jury hears that the judge thinks the evidence is overwhelming, or the judge thinks the evidence is good, obviously that, I think it goes without saying, that would at least affect how they look at the evidence, regardless of what it actually is. And so another piece doesn't really fall into place to really help Hauptmann get a fair shake. And the rest of the criminal justice system, there's a lot of rules and things that are meant to safeguard just the right to have a fair trial. And those dictate what kind of evidence comes in, how that evidence comes in, and that kind of things, and how the jury's selected, getting a fair jury pool, and all of that. And for that, it's kind of interesting to look at how it's framed. And you heard from Linda and from Ken kind of the circus that surrounded the case. And it was known as the trial of the century, because there was so much scrutiny. Everyone was just enraptured by this case, because Lindbergh was probably the most famous person in the world. The crime itself is terrible. It's every parent's worst nightmare, that someone could come into your home while you were there and take your child and end up killing your child. and also the anti-immigrant bias that existed. This was after World War I, before World War II. Hauptmann was a German immigrant, an illegal German immigrant, which the prosecution did make a big deal about. And that also, I think, goes without saying that in no doubt had an effect on the landscape and had a real effect on the trial and the fairness of the proceedings. And the last piece of the puzzle is actually just an interesting quirk, to put it mildly, is they got the death penalty. Bruno Richard Hauptmann was put to death for this case. And how they got there is an interesting process. It's not the obvious way of, well, he murdered a child and therefore he's put to death. Because the prosecution's theory of the case was that while removing the child from the house and going down the ladder, it broke and the child was dropped and broke his head and died as a result of that. And under that theory of accidental death, the death penalty is not on the table. And so they had to find it elsewhere. They had to look further afield. So they decided felony murder was going to be the thing that they were going to hang their hat on. And felony murder is a kind of a technical quirk of the law that if during the commission of a felony or as the result of the commission of a felony, someone dies, whether it's completely intentional or otherwise, anyone who is committing that felony is on the hook for murder and could be put to death. And when people hear that, they're a bit surprised and they think, haha, how quaint that someone back then, they were so backwards to think that was some kind of acceptable way of dealing with this. But surprise, surprise, you only have to look in your backyard, especially if you live in DuPage County, that this kind of thing is still happening. Every day I see cases where someone commits essentially your garden variety retail theft, whether they're stealing a bottle of booze, a pack of gum, or a cart full of merchandise, something that could be a misdemeanor amount and end at that, can be charged and is charged by the state's attorney as a burglary, because it's entering with the intent to commit a theft inside the building. And that's what they chose to charge Hauptmann with. Entering the building, the house, with the intent to steal, not to kidnap, because kidnapping is not a felony. The intent to steal the clothes that the child was wearing. That is what they hung their hat on, and that's what they chose to prove to get the death penalty. And that's what they do in DuPage County. By proving that the person enters the store to steal that pack of gum, they could, depending on potentially 20, 30-year-old history of the client, get that person to go to prison, not get probation, for 6 to 30 years potentially. So it still happens, and it's still a reality in the criminal justice system. And that's what happened in Hauptmann's case. So just the framing of the case itself, the trial and the world in which it existed, gives you pretty big pause about the fairness of the proceedings. And then we turn to the actual trial, what was presented and what was the evidence. And there's kind of 4 key pieces of evidence that I've kind of flagged as interesting to talk about, at least in a surface level way. And first is that identification, the identification by Condon of Hauptmann as being Cemetery John. You've heard that he's a bit of a blowhard. If you read or listen to him talk, it's hard to tell when he's telling the truth, when he's not, when he's embellishing. And that kind of pervaded how he dealt with the case. And as you heard, he didn't make a positive identification until essentially the trial happened, until he was sitting on the stand. He had refused to make that identification previously. He was confronted on cross-examination of that problem. And he came up with the kind of most mind-blowing distinction. He said, no, I had previously identified Hauptmann as John, because identification is merely something that I do in my head. I just didn't declare the identification. I didn't tell anyone about it. And that's a different act. And unfortunately, Mr. Riley cross-examined him on that and how ridiculous that was, but didn't do as an effective job as you would hope, given how absurd that explanation is. And so you see that based on who he was as a person, being potentially a big old liar generally, his seemingly strange identification to begin with, as well as just the general issues with identification in person. Our memory is notoriously bad at times at remembering particularly someone we've met once or twice. If you try to think of someone you met once and you try to accurately describe that person to somebody such that they could draw a sketch or do an investigation, I think you'd find it very hard. And that on top of everything that Dr. Condon was and everything that happened in the case, draws into real question his identification as Hauptmann as John. Next is the money, and Linda talked about they found the money in Hauptmann's house, essentially, in his garage, and it was hidden away. And I think it's irrefutable that it was money that was marked, essentially, or recorded as being the ransom money. And that is circumstantial evidence, and the whole case is circumstantial, which circumstantial evidence is just evidence that suggests or tends to link someone to something. And this is pretty strong circumstantial evidence. Him being in possession of that money is circumstantial evidence that he's connected with the crime. But in what way and how important is that is the real question. What kind of connection does that mean? It doesn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he did the act. It doesn't even prove beyond a reasonable doubt he was connected, but it does suggest a connection of some kind. And so there are questions there that really are unanswered by that evidence alone, which brings us then to the wood and the ladder analysis, as well as handwriting analysis. And I saw there was a question about the handwriting. These are kind of the physical pieces of evidence in the case and the forensic evidence, I guess. The ladder was analyzed by a so-called wood expert that the prosecution tendered, meaning they offered him as an expert on wood. And expert witnesses are supposed to serve to educate a jury, to help a jury understand otherwise technical or hard to understand information is generally their use in the courts. And I've never come across nor have I ever used a wood expert. I'm not sure if they exist, but it is a strange thing to be an expert on, particularly in how it was used. He essentially said that he matched the grain patterns and said that it matched up with a board found in Hauptmann's attic, except there was required there be a missing segment that was never located in order for them to line up. So on its face, that seems like a problematic match. On top of that, he said that he analyzed the milling of the wood and tracked the milling to be being done at a particular mill, and tracked the wood to a place in the Bronx, which was near Hauptmann, and thus further evidence that Hauptmann bought this wood because he did shop there. All of that does seem on its face to be a bit suspect that at that time in 1930s, that someone would be able to do that level of kind of forensic analysis of wood and get it to that accurate a finding. And then the handwriting analysis, which someone asked about, was done. It was done by people. They didn't have computers, obviously, at the time. And for handwriting analysis, they look at individual letters, pairs of letters, groupings of letters that commonly come together to kind of find out how someone tends to write, and then matches up certain features. The prosecution had a parade of handwriting experts that said that he wrote the letters, the ransom notes, and the defense presented some that refuted that. Recently, they have done computer analysis, a rather sophisticated computer analysis where computers look at many different factors, much more than a regular person could normally do. And it seems to suggest that he was not the person. It is more likely he is not than he is the person who wrote those notes. So with the benefit of hindsight, we're left with a little bit lacking there as well. And so just a brief survey of some of the evidence shows that there's big questions about all of it. That combined with the fact of how the trial was done, the world in which it happened, creates a picture that really suggests he didn't get a fair shake, that this was not justice, and really wasn't beyond a reasonable doubt, I don't believe. So that's all for that.
A couple of questions, please, Garrett. How influential was Lindbergh's testimony that he recognized Hauptmann's voice from saying, hey, doctor, over here, from 80 yards away, and how compelling was that to the jury?
I believe, by all accounts, it was very compelling to the jury. Whether or not it should have been, obviously, I'll leave that for everyone to decide, but I would say no, it's not. Particularly because it hadn't been brought up before. His ability to be able to hear Hauptmann speaking before the trial was pretty limited. So I would have a hard time having that stand up to any real scrutiny in a modern day court. But obviously, given Lindbergh's status, he got a little bit wider berth, I think.
So bottom line, do you think Hauptmann was guilty, involved, innocent?
And that I guess I did promise that I would answer the question. And I think as honestly as I can answer it, I don't know. I know that's a cop-out. And so I'll answer it in other ways. One, if I'm asked to be pinned down to, if I could have a crystal ball and look in it, what would I think his involvement was? I'd say, yes, I believe he was involved in some way. There's enough connection there, but that's all I'm comfortable really saying, because what that connection was is very unclear. What I'm more comfortable saying is that I am convinced that he wasn't guilty in the legal sense, in that he wasn't proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's the real concern that I have, and what I focus on, I guess.
There is significant evidence of police malfeasance, which was brought up as one of the questioners asked by Anthony Scaduto in the book Scapegoat, and also by Ludovic Kennedy in The Airman and the Carpenter. Was there any evidence of police malfeasance, actual faking of evidence, like the 16th Rail Board that you discussed in the trial?
I mean, there are a lot of fairly compelling arguments that yes, there was a lot of, and it wouldn't be surprising to know that did happen, just based on what the trial was, what this case was. It was the most important thing in, I'm sure, all of their careers. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all to discover far more than even the defense tried to bring up at the trial. But yes, I mean, they did try to present some evidence of malfeasance. I don't know that it went over particularly well.
How important is your determination of Hauptmann's involvement as to how you play the role?
Well, I mean, as I said, I think the most important thing for me is my understanding of the injustice that is inherent in the case, because I think that's really what the play is about. Since it is a memory play, it's told from, essentially the whole thing is from his perspective. It attempts to be kind of measured about it, but it's fairly one-sided to a certain extent because it is a memory play. That it's about the unfairness and the unjust nature of the whole proceeding at its core. And then as an actor who's trying to do something with that, I mean, all I have is the script. All I have really is the text. I can do as much research as I want. I'm never going to come to the truth of the matter. And so for me, it's most useful to rely on the text. And the text is a man saying and trying to be believed that he is innocent. And I think that taking him at his word and playing it with as much honesty as possible is at least what I believe the best approach, and I think most accessible for me. And it's up to the audience to kind of make the determination if they find it compelling enough. Because I think trying to play someone who's lying, but just continually saying that he's not guilty, is one, incredibly difficult, and two, I think is just confusing and not something that I care to parse out, I guess.
Did he ever confess?
No, and I did skip over that. But he was given the opportunity multiple times following the trial and even up to the date of his execution to essentially make a deal that he could get his life spared if he just essentially pled his guilt, if he just essentially admitted to what happened and told the story. He was offered that on multiple occasions, including just the day he was executed, and he refused all of those, it has an emotional appeal as to why someone would be willing to sacrifice their life. So I think it's a pretty compelling piece of evidence that says that there's more going on. But some people have argued that, he was concerned about his child and his wife, who were on the outside and had to deal with that for the rest of their lives. Which is why I don't take that to be the end all be all as to why he's absolutely innocent. But he could have been involved and still not have been the one who murdered the child, and which I think would square that circle, so to speak, and make that all make sense in a way, which is why, if I'm pinned down to a position, that's the position I take. Let
me just ask Linda one question, if she could unmute, and let's give some love to some of the other cast members, many of whom are on the call with us. Who else besides Garrett, Linda, is in the show?
Oh, well, we have a fantastic cast who make up an amazing ensemble of this production. We have Christopher Williams, who I actually see is on this as well. And then we have Morgan, and we have
Morgan Dietkes, Lars
yeah,
Timpa,
Lars
Todd
Timpa.
Oakley, who
Sorry, I'm
might be
very
on the
bad when it
kicks.
comes to last names. For me, I think of everyone by their character names. So that's just how compelling they were in this production.
Or will be. And Victor Politis, let's not leave him out.
Yes, absolutely.
You said Amanda Fisher?
Oh, yes. Cannot forget Amanda Fisher.
All right. At that juncture, I think we can open it up to questions if anybody is interested. Barry?
Yes, there's a couple of questions that refer to the resources that you've mentioned, the play itself. And so I don't know if a couple of you can mention some of the books, authors, and titles that you relied on for some of your background information.
By all means. Here is one of them, which was relied upon by John Logan. It is called The Airman and the Carpenter. I found this one very compelling and helpful, and it was the source for most of what I had to say. It's written by Ludovic Kennedy. This one is the one that was written that takes the position that Lindbergh was the one responsible, possibly as part of his Charlie was defective in some way. He had rickets and was a little bit slow for his age, and that may have been part of Lindbergh's eugenics convictions. He went on, by the way, to have some 7 children in Germany by 3 different women, 2 of whom were sisters, while still married to Anne. Not necessarily the ideal American hero that we usually think of him as being cracked up to be. This book takes the position, however, that it was an accident as one of his pranks, and the rest of it was a cover-up. The question, that sort of begs the question, who was Cemetery John then? There was another person. Lindbergh was in the car. It wasn't Lindbergh dressing up. And the answer to that seems to be there were a whole bunch of extortion plots by people who weren't necessarily involved in the kidnapping itself. The ransom letter had been published in the newspaper, and Mickey Rosner was given a copy of it and spread it around all over the place. So lots of people could have been involved in lots of various extortion plots, even if Lindbergh was somehow responsible. For me, the most unbiased work on the subject is this one. It's by a Rutgers history professor by the name of Lloyd Gardner. It's called The Case That Never Dies, The Lindbergh Kidnapping. He is probably the best, for me, the best single, most unbiased source for our research.
Wow, great. Thank you very much. Just looking at a couple of the other questions here. Someone asks, sometimes in old crimes, witnesses involved step up years later to recant. And so the person's wondering, did that happen in this case?
Garrett, you want to handle that one?
If
Do
any
you
of the
know anybody recanting their testimony?
I don't. I'm trying to remember now. I'm probably not the best one to handle that one. I don't recall.
I will say that some of the testimony that was adduced was completely unreliable. One of the eyewitnesses against Hauptmann was a gentleman by the name of Amandus Hochmuth, who was at least partly blind at the time that he identified Hauptmann as the person that he had seen on the road. He was a neighbor of Lindbergh's. He claimed to have seen Hauptmann in the vicinity, but he was at least partly legally blind. And in fact, when he was questioned on that subject, he was brought into, I think it was the governor's office. The governor of New Jersey at the time pointed out a vase of flowers on top of a file cabinet and said, can you tell me what that is? And he said, oh, yes, that's a woman's hat. And then, a woman's hat, said the governor. Hochmuth could tell from his tone of voice that he had given a wrong answer. He said, no, it's a bowl of fruit. In any case, not the most reliable witness to be giving an eyewitness identification of Hauptmann at the time.
Right, great.
I don't know but to answer your specific question, I don't know of anybody who specifically went back and said, nah, I told a fib.
All right. Well, and another person asks, is there a single scrap of evidence in the Lindbergh trial that would stand up in court today?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes. I mean, there certainly a decent chunk of the evidence would be admissible at trial. I mean, witness testimony is witness testimony is witness testimony. There's not going to be a way specifically to keep it out per se. It just comes down to whether or not it's believable or reliable. And that's an assessment that's made at trial by the finder of fact. So yes, there would be, I have questions about the expert status of the wood expert. He may not be certified as an expert. It kind of depends on his credentials. I haven't looked specifically into the current status of what is required or what is expected of a wood expert nowadays, and things like that. And the handwriting analysis would be admissible. Obviously, it would be done in a slightly more scientific way, probably, because we have more sophisticated tools. But at the end of the day, forensic science is not as reliable, I think, as some people want to give it credit for. Fingerprint, for instance, fingerprint evidence, just commonly used as kind of the gold standard, other than maybe DNA, because it's been around so long. Isn't what people think. It's not a magic, you see this whole fingerprint and they lift it and then they put it in a computer and voila, you see the exact same match on the other screen, and then they got their guy. Usually they have this weird piece of a fingerprint. They look for certain features, and they mark, oh, there's a whorl here, and there's they mark a certain number of features, and different states have different kind of standards. Illinois doesn't have a specific standard. And they just look for a match of that specific feature. And some states are 5, some are 7, some are none. They just have to say it's a match. And at which point then it's a match, regardless of how the rest of it looks. If there's the whorl here and there's a straight line here and whatever else it is. And that's what fingerprint evidence is, which it seems problematic at the very least.
Right. Right. Someone else who apparently has done their homework said there were witnesses that Bruno was at another place picking up his wife, so that it would not have been physically possible for him to be at the Lindberghs at the time the crime happened. Just wondering if any of you had read about that possibility.
I'll handle that one. Yes, it being a Tuesday night, his wife, Anna, worked at a bakery. And it was his custom, in exchange for performing some menial tasks at the bakery, to go and pick up his wife at the bakery. Moreover, he had just started a job at the Majestic Apartments, and while the records at the Majestic Apartments was another part of the evidence that's apparently tampered with, both according to Scaduto and Kennedy, the person who was his foreman at the Majestic Apartments testified that Hauptmann had worked that day and appeared every other day that week, working from 9 to 5 at the apartments, which is not typically what a kidnapper would have done.
Okay. All right, another person mentions, I understand that Hauptmann was also cast as guilty of crimes in Germany as well, and that played into his guilt. Wondering if anyone knows anything about that aspect.
Absolutely true, but I'll let Linda handle it.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, unfortunately, Hauptmann was connected to several incidents that did not reflect well on him. He was connected with a case where he and a friend pointed guns at women with baby carriages. So that doesn't look very well. Also charged with breaking and entering on several occasions. So these past criminal instances definitely worked against him in court.
They were in the wake of World War I primarily, and at least one of those breaking and entering instances was on a second floor. He actually went in through a ladder to break into somebody's house on the second story, and that didn't look very good. He had, however, I believe, had a completely clean record once he came to the United States.
I think so. And again, going back to a previous question, those do dovetail pretty well. Evidence of prior crimes or prior bad acts, there's law about it, and they can come in as evidence, kind of. But the purpose that they're introduced would be only under normal circumstances to impeach or to call into question the credibility if Hauptmann testified. That would be the only reason. They cannot be used to show a propensity that since he did it before, he's likely to do it again, kind of thing. And because the law hates that kind of activity, except in sex cases, then obviously that's a whole other thing. But that's generally not admissible. And it seems, based on the name, and there's questions about whether or not those things should have been admitted because of the similarity was so close that to argue that the jury wasn't considering that for propensity is kind of ridiculous. I can't imagine that the jury didn't look at those things and say, yeah, I mean, he did this exact thing essentially before by going in a second story window, which makes me think that a lot of judges nowadays wouldn't allow some of those prior crimes in because of the danger of undue prejudice. And while their probative value, meaning the value that they add to the case, isn't enough to overcome that. Obviously, adding to the fact that since they're out of the country, getting proof of those is difficult as well.
Yeah. Someone else asks, did any of the jurors ever discuss their deliberations, if we know?
Garrett?
I actually don't know. That wasn't in the materials that I read. I think I imagine that it probably was discussed, but I'm not sure.
I think that the case was probably over the second Lindbergh testified, to be quite honest. I don't think that any of the jurors had second thoughts. If they did, they didn't express them. Okay. There was and one other factor I would like to mention is in terms of not only the fact that Hauptmann was an illegal alien, but the amount of money that the two sides had to spend for experts. The prosecution spent close to $1 million in Depression era bucks in order to prosecute this case. Hauptmann had approximately $4,000 for the defense, and as Garrett made reference to, Edward Riley was for free. He was only working so that the newspaper that paid him could get an exclusive scoop.
Right. Okay. Someone asks, did Hauptmann's wife stand by him as the case progressed?
Linda?
Yes, absolutely. She maintained that he was innocent to the rest of her days. She even tried to bring a lawsuit against the head of the prosecution, David T. Willens, accusing him of having manufactured evidence or withheld evidence that would have exonerated him. Those didn't work out for her, unfortunately, but she was convinced of her husband's innocence, and Hauptmann, of course, maintained his innocence to the day of his death.
She continued campaigning for his acquittal right up to the day she died, which was, I believe, in 1994. Wow. Taking it up on appeal, campaigning the governor, absolutely convinced of his innocence throughout her life.
Another question about the tracing of the money. This person asks, would Hauptmann have known that the money could be traced? Was that common knowledge then that bills could be traced?
Well, they were traced because the ransom was paid they obviously put it together and they put them in sequential bills. So they recorded the serial numbers. It was also paid in gold certificates, which were being taken out of circulation at the time. So they were much more easy to spot. So it's doubtful that people, and when the authorities distributed the lists of the bills, the serial numbers to banks and things like that, in order to catch them when they came in, they didn't actually they didn't say why. They just said that they would be to notify the authorities when these came in. So there wouldn't even necessarily have been a leak there. So not likely. I mean, obviously the nature of the tracing, I guess one could divine that that's possible. They could have written down the serial numbers. It wasn't particularly scientific, but I doubt he would have known.
Hauptmann always asserted that he had no more idea that it was Lindbergh ransom money than the man in the moon. It's not even entirely clear that Fish knew that it was Lindbergh ransom money, rather that he bought it from some other party. Because Fish, when he went back to Germany, where he eventually died of leukemia, couldn't afford doctors. That doesn't sound like somebody who's come into a great deal of wealth either. Right. So Fish's family always maintained that he was innocent too.
Right. You mentioned that Hauptmann's wife had, proclaimed his innocence for a long time, up to her death not that long ago. And someone asks, were there any more modern day reexaminations of the case? We talked about a couple of books, but perhaps in the legal area.
Garrett?
I missed the first part of the question.
Was the case taken up again legally after the trial in the 1930s?
Got it. Yes. I mean, there was appeal filed. I think there, as is pretty much always the case when there's a capital case, or most cases of a more serious variety. It was affirmed on appeal. I know that there was some, I think Edward Riley, tried to shake down his wife for more money, even though he had been paid by the newspaper. And so how well the appeal was handled obviously is up for debate. And appeals tend, statistically speaking, aren't really things that generally work out for the defense. And given the tenor of the world at the time, I mean, I don't know that was going to go anywhere, because I think a lot of the legal issues are kind of more in hindsight and more factual than they are legal, like technically legal.
As Garrett made reference to in terms of the handwriting evidence, not only were there computer analyses that tended to indicate that while the writer probably was of German origin, it did not really match Hauptmann's writing. A handwriting expert by the name of Gus Lesnevich in 1983, a little bit more recent, came to the conclusion that an examination, comparison, and analysis of the question ransom notes and known writings not used by the police, along with the additional known writings, has resulted in the conclusion that Mr. Richard Hauptmann did not write the questioned ransom notes.
And another person is mentioning just the fame of Lindbergh himself and how that may have played into some of the results in the trial. I don't know if we can suggest who in the contemporary world would be an equal to how much notoriety he had, so that we can grasp the impact that he might have had on the trial when he seemed so convinced himself that Hauptmann was guilty. Are there people, celebrities today that we could compare with, perhaps, to understand how influential he was?
I mean, to be perfectly honest, I would think it would be hard to find a single celebrity. I mean, I think because our world is so much more connected in so much more granular ways, that I don't know that any one person can reach that level of respect and notoriety. You'd have to combine all the celebrities together, because the amount of information people learn about celebrities in the world, it was so much different. And so it allowed kind of the cream to rise in a different way. So I don't know that you can find a single person that had that kind of sway over the public at this point in time.
Yeah, someone is suggesting perhaps, at least as far as notoriety, O.J. Simpson, and how much that trial captured, the attention of the entire country.
That's the other trial of the century. I need to make one correction. Someone has corrected me that Fish died of tuberculosis. I think I misspoke earlier.
Okay. Another question about the child's mother. Did Anne Moreau, Lindbergh's wife, believe that her husband was involved in any way?
Not to my knowledge. I don't think she would have accepted that. She was the one. She did have pranks played on her. I don't think she ever suspected. If she did, she didn't express it. Charles, of being involved in the death of her son.
Okay. Just looking through these questions to make sure that we got at least somewhat close to most of them. Just wondering about the comparison of how the evidence would play out in trial today, how the case might have been handled differently. I think you've certainly touched on some of those. I don't know if there's anything else to be said about that.
I mean, the case would be handled a bit differently. I mean, hopefully it would be handled more competently. And I think more importantly, the investigation would be handled better, because all the errors flowing from that just polluted downstream so much at the trial that it's hard to say, really. The tools available and the kind of professionalism and the lack of a Lindbergh figure being able to head the investigation for the most critical time period, being the beginning of it. That is probably more where the differences would be, and then that would all flow downstream. But yes, there would be some differences at trial. I don't know if they would have gotten in all of the evidence that they did, and hopefully the defense would get a little better opportunity, a little fairer shake to present what they wanted to without editorializing by the judge.
Are there any others that you've come across, any other individuals linked to the case that you suspect, or that you think probably had something to do with it that perhaps weren't tried for the crime?
There's an interesting, going back to things that you can look at, books or otherwise, PBS did an interesting documentary on it. And there was a theory floated there by just this random guy whose I think his father or grandfather had told him a story about when he was very young, hearing some people talking and hearing someone being referred to as Bruno, and knowing who the other person was. And that person, if you look at the sketch artist sketch of Cemetery John, the guy's name was John Knoll, and he was a German immigrant as well. And that documentary, which is, I think, available on YouTube for free, you can just watch it, it talks about that at length. And he did have a little bit of a weird something going on with his thumb, which does line up with the fleshy growth or whatever that was noted by Dr. Condon, and his face had a little bit more similarity to the sketch than did Hauptmann's. So that there's some interestingly compelling, and he would have a connection with Hauptmann and some other people in that neighborhood. And so there is a fairly compelling case. And he also spent a lot of money immediately following. He paid for some very expensive tickets out of the country on an ocean liner across the sea after this happened. And he was living outside his means, it seemed, and came back after Hauptmann was put to death. So there's a pretty compelling story to be made there, and it's an interesting watch, and it's reasonably measured in how it looks at everything.
The book and that Garrett is referring to, I believe, is called Cemetery John, and I believe it's written by somebody named Robert Zorn. I may not have that name exactly right,
I believe so.
but in fact, the diagram, or the drawing rather, of Cemetery John that Linda showed during her portion much more closely resembles the person to whom Garrett just referred than it does Hauptmann.
Interesting. All right. There's another question about what happened with the Lindberghs after this crime, and I think you spoke a little bit about them leaving the country to escape some of all of the publicity. You want to talk a little bit to that?
Lindbergh did in fact go to Germany, tried to, he was a big fan of the Luftwaffe. He didn't think that the Allies had any chance of defeating the German Air Force. He argued vehemently for isolationism. They remained married, though, not despite his attempts at finding the perfect child in Germany, and eventually he did return.
Okay. And someone is asking about them moving to Maui and another child growing up there.
That I don't know about.
Okay. All right. I think we're getting to the point where we can wrap up here. Someone's asking where does the play start and end relative to the kidnapping?
It starts way after. It starts. The time period is a bit amorphous because it's a memory play, but he is in custody and he is set to be executed essentially through the course of the whole show, and so you can imagine it being a couple days while he's waiting to be executed up until it ends essentially for him and for the play. So it is well after all of the events, but you see through kind of his storytelling and through the ensemble portraying it as he's kind of describing it. You see a lot of the events of the crime and the investigation.
Well, and we can't wait to see it, live and have all of you back. We certainly want to thank Wheaton Drama for doing this for us. Very fascinating, wonderful look at this piece of history that still captures our attention. So thank you so much to each of you for all the time and effort that went into providing this presentation. We will be putting out the link to Wheaton Drama because we're all going to be watching that to find out when you're able to reopen and go ahead and put on this production. The recording of this presentation will be on the library's website. If you go into wheatonlibrary.org and then to virtual library and adult virtual library, there's a playlist of all of our recordings, and it will be added to that so that you can watch this program again or recommend it to a friend. So again, that will be uploaded in the next couple of days. But thank you again so much, all of you, for participating. Unless there's something else that you'd like to say, there's many thank yous, appreciation coming through in the chat and the Q&A. But with that, I think we will say good night, everybody. Take care. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and we hope to see you again soon. Good night.